High in the Alps, in the year 1450, winter has sealed the world. The mountain passes are buried under many feet of snow. The roads have vanished. No traveller will come up the valley, and no one will leave it until the thaw of late spring. And on a remote shelf of rock, surrounded by towering white peaks, stands a monastery, a cluster of stone buildings around a church, cut off entirely from the rest of humanity for the next several months. Inside live perhaps a few dozen monks, sealed into their mountain fastness with their prayers, their books, their stores of food, and one another. For half the year, this is one of the most isolated communities on earth, a small, self-contained world of silence, routine, faith, and survival, alone against the mountain and the cold. Today, we are going to climb up through the snow and step inside this Alpine monastery in the depths of winter and discover what it was like to live, pray, work, and endure through the long, frozen months when the monastery was utterly cut off from the world. Using advanced AI trained on the surviving Alpine monasteries and their records, the rules and routines of medieval monastic life, the architecture and archaeology of mountain religious communities, and the accounts of medieval travelers and monks, we have reconstructed a winter inside the snowbound monastery. The first thing to understand is why anyone would build a monastery in such a place at all. Monasteries were often built in remote and difficult places on purpose. The monastic life was a deliberate withdrawal from the world, a turning away from the distractions, temptations, and noise of ordinary society in order to devote oneself entirely to God. A remote mountain location offered exactly the solitude, silence, and separation from worldly life that the monastic ideal demanded. But some Alpine monasteries had another, very practical purpose as well. They were built high in the mountain passes to serve travelers, to offer shelter, food, and rescue to the pilgrims, merchants, and wayfarers who had to cross the dangerous high passes between the lands on either side of the Alps. The monks of such places performed a vital and dangerous service, maintaining a refuge in the killing heights, and in some famous cases, breeding and keeping the great mountain rescue dogs that would go out into the snow to find travelers lost and dying in the drifts. So the Alpine monastery was at once a place of withdrawal from the world, and paradoxically, a lifeline for those who had to pass through the most dangerous gateway in the mountains. But in the deep of winter, when the passes closed entirely, even that traffic ceased, and the monastery was left alone. Life in the monastery was governed above all by the rule and by the clock of prayer. Medieval monks lived according to a strict rule that ordered every hour of every day, and the heart of that order was the cycle of prayer. The monks rose in the deep dark of the night, while the snow lay silent outside and the cold gripped the stone buildings, to gather in the church for the first prayers of the day, sung in the candlelit gloom. Through the day and into the night, at fixed intervals, the bell would call them back again and again to the church to sing the prayers and psalms of the divine office, the great daily round of worship that structured the entire monastic existence. 8 times across the day and night, the monks gathered to pray and to sing, their voices rising in the cold air of the church, an unbroken cycle of devotion that continued day after day through the whole long winter, regardless of the snow, the cold, or the isolation. This rhythm of prayer was the spine of the monastery's life. It never stopped. It was, in a sense, the very reason the monastery existed, to keep the prayers rising to heaven in this remote and frozen place through every hour of every day, all winter long. But prayer alone did not keep the community alive. The monastery in winter was, above all, a problem of survival, and that survival depended on what had been gathered and stored before the snows came. Through the brief Alpine summer and autumn, the monks and their lay servants had labored to prepare for the long siege of winter. They had harvested what crops the high, short-growing season allowed. They had gathered and stored enormous quantities of firewood, the single most precious resource of the winter, for without fire, the community would freeze. They had filled their storerooms with grain for bread, with dried and salted meat and fish, with cheese made from the milk of their animals, with preserved vegetables and fruits, with wine or ale, with the stores that would have to last until spring. Animals were kept through the winter in byres beneath or beside the living quarters, both to keep them alive and, in a clever piece of design common in Alpine buildings, so that the body heat of the animals helped to warm the rooms above. When the first great snows came and sealed the passes, the monastery became a closed system, surviving entirely on what it had stored. If the harvest had been poor, or the winter proved longer than expected, hunger and even starvation were real dangers in the isolated months ahead. The cold inside the monastery was a constant, gnawing presence. Medieval stone buildings, high in the mountains, in the depths of winter, were brutally cold. Most of the monastery was unheated. The great church, where the monks gathered to pray through the freezing nights, was often bitterly cold, the monks' breath visible in the candlelight, their fingers stiff on their prayer books. The one room that was usually heated was the warming room, a chamber with a fire where the monks were permitted to come and thaw their frozen hands and feet, often the only properly heated space in the entire community, a small island of warmth in a frozen world. The monks slept in a communal dormitory or in small cells, wrapped in their woolen habits and what blankets they had, and they wore heavy layers of wool against the cold. The discipline of enduring cold and discomfort was, in fact, part of the monastic ideal, a way of mortifying the flesh and humbling the body in the service of the soul. But there is a difference between spiritual discipline and freezing to death, and the monks managed the cold carefully, rationing firewood, huddling in the warming room, keeping the animals close, and relying on the thick stone walls and small windows that, while cold, at least kept out the worst of the wind and the snow. Beyond prayer and survival, the monks filled the long winter with work, and some of that work was among the most important in all of medieval civilization. The monastic ideal held that idleness was the enemy of the soul, and so the monks worked through the winter at their various tasks. There was the endless labor of maintaining the community, cooking, cleaning, tending the fire, caring for the animals, mending clothing and tools, clearing snow, and the constant work of simply keeping a community alive through the winter. And there was the work for which the monasteries became justly famous, the copying of books. In the Scriptorium, the writing room, monks labored to copy manuscripts by hand, reproducing the texts of scripture of the Church Fathers, and crucially, of the ancient classical authors of Greece and Rome, page by painstaking page, in beautiful lettering, sometimes adorned with exquisite illuminations and decorations. The long, quiet, enclosed winters, when there was nothing to do but stay inside and work, were ideal for this patient labor. Through this work, performed across countless monasteries over many centuries, including remote and snowbound ones like this, the literature and learning of the ancient world were preserved and transmitted across the dark and difficult centuries, kept alive by the patient pens of monks working through long mountain winters by the light of a candle. And there was a deep psychological and spiritual dimension to the long isolation. To be sealed into a small community for months on end, cut off entirely from the outside world with the same few dozen faces, the same routines, the same prayers, day after day after day, was a profound test of the human spirit. The monastic life was designed in part for exactly this. The rule, the routine, the constant round of prayer and work gave structure and meaning to the long, dark, enclosed months, holding at bay the boredom, the loneliness, and the despair that such isolation could breed. The silence that monks often kept, the discipline of their days, the shared purpose of their devotion, bound the community together and gave them the inner resources to endure. For the monks, the snowbound winter was not merely something to be survived, it was, in a sense, the purest expression of their whole way of life. Alone with God and one another, cut off from the world, devoted entirely to prayer, work, and the salvation of their souls, in a silence and a solitude that the rest of humanity could scarcely imagine. And when the spring finally came, when the snows began to melt and the passes slowly reopened, and the first traveller in many months appeared, weary, at the monastery gate, the monks would welcome him, feed him, and hear his news of the world they had been cut off from for so long, the world returning, at last, to their mountain. That was a winter inside a 15th century Alpine monastery sealed off by the snow. A small community of monks, cut off entirely from the world for months on end, surviving on the food and fuel they had gathered before the passes closed, enduring the brutal mountain cold in their unheated stone buildings, gathering 8 times a day and through the freezing nights to sing their prayers, working at their endless tasks, and copying, By candlelight, in the long dark winters, the precious books that preserved the learning of the ancient world. It was a life of hardship, isolation, cold, and discipline, and also, for those who chose it, a life of profound purpose and peace, alone with God in the silence of the high mountains, while the snow fell and the world below was shut away beyond the impassable passes. Many of these mountain monasteries still stand today, some of them still home to monks, still keeping their ancient rhythms of prayer in the high, cold places of the world. And every winter, when the snow returns and seals the heights once more, something of that ancient experience returns with it. The silence, the cold, the candlelight, and the quiet, unbroken sound of prayer rising into the frozen dark, exactly as it has for hundreds upon hundreds of years.